All right, hello everybody. My name is Mark Wolf. I discovered the grand unified theory of game design, and in this video, we're going to get a little more strict with our idea of limited resources. But when I say that, I mean strict on game designers, not players. What do I mean? Well, it may surprise you to find out that so far in these videos, I've actually been kind of lax in how I've been speaking about things, giving examples. Some of the examples I've been given, I've been giving, exist in a whole lot of games, and some of them are done more right than others. But it kind of gives you a little bit of leeway to think, okay, well, so I can kind of do these things that I'm already comfortable with, and then hopefully you're maybe a little inspired to refine them because you start to see the little cracks in how you might have implemented it. So, excuse me. The point here is that players can handle a whole lot more fun. And what you want to be doing as a game designer, what you want to think of your design process as, is an arms race with every other game designer in the world to give players the most fun possible. And a lot of this is going to come down to exactly how well you understand formal game theory. And part of this is just avoiding big things like, hey, you know what? Spend some time on the math of your game. Make sure it is fair and balanced. Make sure it's not solvable. Don't make the mistake of implementing a situation where you've designed something where victory is random. Those are kind of bigger, easier things to figure out. But what's going to catch a lot of your players up, and what's harder to figure out, is where those limited resources, the things that are design pitfalls, where you had good intentions, but the way you did it, could have been done better. So let's get more specific. One of the examples I gave for a limited resource in combat is thinking about something like a cooldown. Now, the concept of a cooldown isn't a terrible idea in and of itself, but almost everywhere you see cooldowns implemented, they're done very arbitrarily. A better way to do a cooldown would be something that you can build up to. I think, let's see here. An example of this would probably be the Dragon Ball Z fighting games for like PlayStation 2. There was also for like GameCube, but they released them for all the consoles then. But one of the concepts was that you built up key energy for your attacks through physical punches or through physical attacks when they landed. So sometimes it was fairly easy to figure out, at least for the very basic, like Hadouken, like Kamehameha or whatever that your character had, whatever their normal base energy attack was. It was pretty easy to figure out like exactly how many punches before you could just do one with the energy that you'd gained. And so it was pretty easy to figure out, very formulaic combos, punch them 3 times, do a Kamehameha, and then you can just do that over and over again. That is very boring, but for something like an MMO, where you're in a much more strategic combat, in a real game especially, where the placement of your character, the actual aiming of your attacks can matter, and maybe even like where you are on the battle space or your proximity to certain things. Maybe somebody on your team, or like in WoW, like your proximity maybe to a totem if you're a shaman, or your proximity to the enemy. Whatever variables you're using, you can give those things to the player to build up for that combo. So instead of having a cooldown, you could have the ability be on a build up. And you could, kind of think of it as a cooldown where it's like you can't do it until you build up again. But now you've given that control to the player. Much, much, much better. There might be some other situational cooldowns that would be fine to implement, but the thing to focus on is just to not make things arbitrary. You always want to have a good reason for something, and the reason is always going to come back to the competition, making it relevant to what the current competition scope is. So the other examples I was giving, like for stealth. So when you maybe would use an ability to figure out, like there are some MMOs where you can use an ability to actually read other characters' stats, and this would help you figure out, like, oh, what are their limits. But in a in a more dynamic sense, maybe it could just be like color coded. Like if you could sneak past them, it would be green. If they would sense you, it would be red. Something like that. The dynamics that are kind of governing that are the limited resources between their ability to sense you and I would really hasten to specify something that doesn't have to be in the physical control of the player, that is a stat variable that determines their stealth. So, like the actual amount of noise they generate when they move in stealth mode, or how close they can get to things while remaining invisible. But maybe if they get too close to an enemy, like they lose stealth or something. That's another thing too, is like, so I'm just kind of throwing that out there as an example, but I'm just throwing that off the top of my head. I actually should think about that. If I was designing a game with that idea, I couldn't just throw that out there. I'd have to throw that out there as an idea, and then having floated it, actually analyze it. What are the consequences of putting that in the game? Does that take agency away from the player? Does that give them strategic choice? Does that give them customization of strategy? Is that fair? Is that balanced? Those are things that you need to be checking to hone in on the most fun way to do things. The things that remove real world relevance. You don't want to make physical aptitude the defining factor, to give players creative choices that are balanced so that they can choose the strategy they want to play and then optimize it. And the things that they choose to adapt it, they can again have agency there. It's not solved. There may be like there may be specific types of things that you'd have to consider, like in a Pokemon example. Like if you're trying to defend against a specific type of damage, then maybe your scope would be limited to whatever counter type defended against that. But the way that you implement that defense should still be customizable to what your existing strategy is as a player, in a way that isn't pre-solved by the game, that predetermines that there is some better answer that if you chose would give you a better strategy, so that so that you don't lose agency, you don't remove strategy being required to win. When you take agency away from the player, you remove strategy in some cases. Strategy is no longer required to win because the decision is made for you. So, limited resources. The next example is going to be talking more about the rooms, and talking about terrain. So, kind of, I don't know if this concept really applies everywhere, especially when you get down to more abstracted concepts like mechanical games, tabletop games that may not have direct, illustrated flavor, something like Cards Against Humanity, very abstract in concept. Some of these things could still apply, and I think maybe they do universally apply. But what I'm speaking to more is, the more common conventions of game design. So by room design, if you were doing something more abstract like Cards Against Humanity, maybe what you would be thinking of more is like, if each round was set up differently, then these would be things that would be specific to a round. And these would be things that would be available to everyone in the round, which would, of course, be all players, because you wouldn't exclude anybody, because that would be taking away their agency. It would also be violating immersion, because then they'd be not playing the game. But talking in more conventional terms, the room resources and the environment are both the same thing. It may be weird to think of it this way, but this is how a game designer should think of it. Even an outside environment is still a dungeon. Everything is sectioned off in a game, no matter how abstract, in isolated regions in which things occur in iterations. So if you're looking at an MMO map, there are actually regions where there are mechanical boundaries, and normally these are mob boundaries where the enemies specifically spawn. But these could also have other very more literal boundaries, like contested territories. And so when you're thinking about limited resources, these things apply both in an outside environment, if you're designing that stylistically, as much as to an inside environment, like a more literal Zelda dungeon room or a D&D dungeon room. So, like, one example is, if you have two contested territories, limited resources, like in an MMO, could very interestingly be things they could lob at each other. Like, if there were mortar stations at equidistant points and players could, run up and move the aiming and try to hit players on the other side. So that if you were in the region, it was just kind of like a, artillery battlefield. And I don't know, maybe there would be other components there, but one of the limited resources would be that each of these nearby contested territories had things they could attack each other with that weren't necessarily like player weapons. They were like terrain weapons. In a dungeon, this could be just as relevant. You could have something in a room that could affect something in another. And these are resources that a player can use. The way that you think of it, I guess, in that case, could be if there's something keeping them from that. There's some obstacle. Maybe it would be the actual enemy protecting it, or a different enemy protecting it, or um, maybe there's nothing protecting it. Maybe they just have to, you know, actually, you know what? We should think about this as a competition. So if you were to do that, then you would have to figure out why that was there, how that played out in the combat, and maybe the enemy also has access to it. So part of what you're doing is sort of like a king of the hill. You're trying to maybe keep them off of that weapon or keep them off of that resource, but you could also use it yourself. And maybe it's equally as hard for them to get to it as it is for you. So, yeah, anyway. And I guess, so right then I just had a thought and I just didn't know if I should say it, but now that I'm thinking about it, obviously I should clarify there. So what you want to make sure then, if you did that, was to make sure that the way you designed the math of that combat, that it was actually strategically relevant, that the resource actually made a difference, so that it didn't make actual mathematical sense. It wasn't solved to the point that it made better sense to avoid the resource and to attack the enemy directly. You don't put a red herring in a combat situation like that. You don't do that to players. That's the opposite of game design. And I'm pretty sure I've seen this in game somewhere, although I can't think of any specific examples, and I'm glad because I don't want to call anybody out for this. But I can certainly imagine examples where there would be something included in a game, but it didn't really help you. It was just because they thought it would be good set dressing, and they made it functional, but they didn't actually go through the trouble of making it relevant. Maybe I'm thinking probably of examples I've seen from like Game Boy games or something. I don't know. It seems like something that would happen in a Game Boy game. So, wow. Okay, I've been talking for a little longer than I thought I have, so I'm going to stop here and get to the next topic. I'm trying as hard as I can to get out of competition. I want to get down more of the list, but I just keep thinking up topics to clarify and go over. But I can come back to these. We don't have to do these exactly in order, but I want to try to do as much as possible. So thank you again for listening, and these are just going to be long videos.